My name is Dr. Sandy Morgan. I'm a registered nurse, I'm a minister, and I'm the director of the Global Center for Women and Justice here at Vanguard University. I have studied intercultural studies and I did my research in the Middle East, in Iraq, and have become very involved in working with vulnerable refugee populations. But my work on human trafficking began before I even really understood the terminology, before they had terminology. Back when I was a brand new pediatric charge nurse on night shift, of course, I admitted a 14-year-old boy who was being sold for commercial sex by his mother and stepfather to support their drug habit, 2 a.m. So we didn't have terminology, and one of the things that people sometimes say to me, well, I don't know what to do when I see things like that because this is so new. But one of the things I want you to understand is we've had laws against sexually assaulting children for decades. So you don't need new laws for that. We can enhance the charges. We can get other resources once the child is in the system. But just to start it, you just need to know that if this is a minor, we have resources to help them. Okay, so you've got my contact information here, and you're more than welcome to email me or call our office. We recently added an assistant director. Derek Marsh is retired deputy chief from Westminster PD and has been a Bureau of Justice Assistance fellow, training on labor trafficking, and also has been training for the United Nations in Rwanda, and next week he'll be in Kenya. Nairobi is in Kenya, right? Yeah, okay, geography, got it. So tonight we're gonna look at reading the signs, identifying victims of human trafficking, and the things I want you to walk away from here with is to understand your role in identifying potential victims, whether they're foreign, domestic, or minor, and understand the definition of human trafficking, identify traffickers' control and coercion techniques, and know when and how to report or refer a potential human trafficking victim. This 2014 December issue of Annals of Health Law published a report, a research report that was led by a colleague of mine, Dr. Laura Letter, and it talked about healthcare providers and how they see victims, but they don't really see them. So in that research, with about 250 interviews of survivors, 87.8%, let that soak in, were seen by a healthcare professional in an emergency room, in a Planned Parenthood clinic, in a primary care practitioners, urgent care clinics, neighborhood clinics, women's clinics. I did a training for a medical group of physicians up in Anaheim, and they are now seeing, as primary care practitioners, a larger number of 18 to 24-year-old women who are on Medi-Cal. And so when they saw this, they started saying, oh my goodness, we didn't even realize what we were seeing. And so we sometimes think, well, it's only gonna be in the emergency room, but you're going to see this. My daughter used to be a NICU nurse. She called me one night because the baby she caught was a 12-year-old little girl's baby. And when the, air quotes, dad showed up, he was in his mid to late 20s. And she's calling me, Mom, I think it's human trafficking. She lives in Roseville, California. It's 2:30 in the morning. I said, calling me won't help. You need to learn how to report. And so one of the things that I wanted to make sure you have is all of the different numbers. The blue campaign, has the Department of Homeland Security. The the Live to Free card has the Polaris number, the Health and Human Services number, which is a national hotline, 888-3737-888. And it has a text number on it, 233-733, which is Be Free. How many of you know young adults, and of course adolescents, that never make a phone call? They text everything. So this is becoming a really hot texting number to have for reporting. So just so that we begin to understand how important our role is. And not just licensed and credentialed healthcare providers, but everybody, the clinic staff, the respiratory and physical therapists, radiology. I have this dream someday to train every radiology tech that works with the emergency room, because they're the only ones that absolutely never have to let another person in, and they can have one-on-one conversation. But you'll begin to understand why that's important. School and public health nurses, they're all very important. Our Live to Free team went out and did outreach at walk-in clinics in Orange County. They did 5, 10, and 15-minute presentations to whoever would listen to them, and sometimes it was just the person at the desk. The very first week that they did this, 2 Asian women were rescued because not the doctor, but the front office staff recognized the signs of human trafficking and called the 888 number. Why I believe that healthcare providers are so important, across a lot of cultures where I've been, when you talk to them about the judges and the attorneys and the law enforcement, they don't trust them. They tell me stories of corruption. But when you talk about the nurse and the doctor, then they have to help me, because that's what they're for. So they trust you, and you have unique access. When someone's doing screening for human trafficking and it's a law enforcement person or even sometimes social workers, there's a lot of suspicion. But a healthcare provider, you're the nurse, you're supposed to get their baseline assessment done, and you have a clipboard, although now you don't. You have a tablet, right? And you're asking questions, and your job is to ask questions. So you have a place of being able to identify possible victims that no one else has that opportunity. And then finally, I remember taking the test back in nursing school. You are legally a patient advocate. I used to work in the operating room, and when my patient was asleep, I was legally responsible for what happened to them. So I believe that as we begin to understand our commitment to our patients, that this becomes a super important aspect of how we care for possible victims of human trafficking. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline, 888-3737-888, and I always say it at least 3 times in every presentation, and by the time you walk out, you should be able to say it. In fact, let's just practice it. Ready? 888-3737-888. I was up in Los Angeles today. They have a team of 24 investigators at the Sheriff's Department doing anti-human trafficking. And no matter where you are in LA, Orange County, San Diego, or if you're in Seattle, Washington, this number works. Learning the language and the process. So how many of you know that for a police officer starting out on the patrol, they go to school for maybe 6 months in police academy, right? Yep. And how long does it take you to get your nursing license? Okay, so my point is that in the early days when I went to train, the nurses and the doctors complained about law enforcement and complained they didn't get it or they weren't responding correctly. And I just want to challenge you. You have higher expectations of what they're supposed to know, and they don't know your job. But you have the opportunity to learn the language so that they understand what's going on. And this particular little tutorial, and Julie will make sure that Dr. Wilson will make sure you have access to this PowerPoint. Takes about 30 minutes, and it goes through all of the basics. I'm going to go through those things now, but it's really good to do this with review, do this as a briefing for your department, your shift, whatever. But it has glossary you forgot what that word means, then you can look it up. And then what I really love is the next button. When you get to the little quizzes, it won't let you go to the next button until you answer the question. Those are the best quizzes for my students, and I'm pretty much that way too. And if you get it wrong, it lets you know. I learn more when I make a mistake than when I get it right the first time. So this will take you about 30 minutes. It's a great introduction. Labor trafficking. Labor trafficking is about 68% of global trafficking. I spend a lot of time with Department of Labor Senior Deputy District something for California, Federal Department of Labor, Paul Chang. And recently he was explaining to me how textile factories right here, that some of them even put Made in America labels on them, have deep roots in international trafficking, and the people in those sweatshops literally are slaves. Today he was explaining to me, because I met him at another meeting, how to set up a modular business for textile costs, with all the machines and hire the whole thing, about $2 million. If you're going to set this up as an illicit business and you're going to use labor trafficked people, slaves, guess how much it costs to set up, to start production? What? 100,000? $25,000. So the reason trafficking works is because it's profitable. People make a lot of money. And there's a myth that there's more sex trafficking than there is labor trafficking. But the reality is you find what you're looking for, and we've been looking for sex trafficking. So that's why we have a preponderance of sex trafficking cases. We have to start looking for labor trafficking victims who come into your ER and they've been wounded, we're not in a war zone right now, okay, although it feels like it. They've been injured at a construction site, and you look at them and they're not wearing any of what you would expect construction workers to wear. They don't have on the prerequisite steel-toed shoes and things like that. So asking those kinds of questions, being alert to that, is important. Labor trafficking, about 8% of homeless youth in a study done last year were labor trafficked, selling magazines, being forced into selling drugs by gangs. This particular book by Shima Hall, she was a child maid brought here from Egypt and was rescued in a gated community, $1.6 million home in Irvine, where she was a slave taking care of a family with 2 adults and 5 children. And she slept in an unvented room in the garage with no light, no air, no windows. And when she was rescued because somebody in the neighborhood noticed that this little girl didn't go to school. And when they rolled out to pick her up, to check on her, they realized that this was a trafficking situation. And so the school officials had checked first. So then they called law enforcement. Law enforcement came in a black and white car. And the trafficker had told Shima that if they ever come, They're going to put you in a police car and take you away, and you'll never see your family again. And guess what happened? They knocked on the door. She didn't understand any English. They grabbed her, put her in the car, handed her a phone with somebody speaking to her in Arabic. And all she knew is, I'm never going to see my family again. Everything the trafficker said, and we're going to talk about confirmation bias when we're talking about how to communicate with victims. I just want you to know her book is a great look into the experience of a labor trafficking slave. She's 25 now and has 2 beautiful little girls, and she's a U.S. citizen, so she's doing really, really well. I like telling happy stories, but I have some sad ones too. So learning the language, we like to be able to have a list of the signs and symptoms and diagnose something, right? So I've got 3 columns for you, and you have to have one thing from each column in order to have the elements of an anti-human trafficking case. So you have an action. Someone has recruited, harbored, transported, provided, or obtained a person through the use, means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of a commercial sex act or labor or services. Now notice, commercial sex act. What does the word commercial mean? Somebody's paying for it. It's a business. People go into business, they start a commerce, a commercial industry in order to make money. So let me tell you, I lived in Greece for over 10 years, which is where I really started my anti-trafficking advocacy. And I was a volunteer at Doctors of the World shelter. And I'm going to tell you the story of Maria to kind of help us have a narrative to hang these principles on. Maria was 17 when she graduated at the top of her class in high school in the Ukraine. Her family was depending on her to become the breadwinner, her mother and 8-year-old brother. Her father had died in an earlier Chechen conflict, not the current one we saw just a couple years ago. And so there were no jobs. The Soviet Union had collapsed. There was no young men to date, to get married so somebody would take care of you because they'd all gone off to the Chechen conflict. And her mother was supporting them, washing laundry. She had no education, so it was Maria's job to get a job and be the breadwinner. When she saw an ad for jobs in Greece, she and her best friend took the bus into the big city, went to the hotel suite where they were doing the interviews, stood in line with dozens of other girls, filled out a job application, just like you would if you were applying at Starbucks. What do you put on a job application? All your information, everything. And if you're taking a job leaving the country, you put your next of kin, so they can know where you are and they can report if there's any problems. So Maria was really excited to go home and tell her mother, I got the job and I'm going to send half the money to you and half I'm going to save to go to nursing school. So she had dreams. 2 weeks later, she shows up at the train station and she has all of her legal travel documents along with several other girls. They're handed over to the travel coordinator. They take the train down to the Black Sea. They take the ferry across. Now they're in Turkey, a bus to a little dingy hotel on the Turkish-Greek border. Each girl is put in a separate room. And Maria told us that within just a few minutes of when she laid her head down, 4 men dressed in police uniforms, not because they were necessarily law enforcement, but this was the start of breaking her down. They gang raped her. While she was still numb from that experience, the madame came before dawn and took her downstairs where they duct taped her ankles, her wrists, and her mouth and placed her in the false bottom of a little car, and she was driven across into Greece where prostitution is legal and there were brothel owners waiting to purchase her. When she became very, very sick, she was moved every 2 to 3 weeks. This means that she couldn't develop relationships. They didn't keep the girls together, so they wouldn't become friends, because Julie and I, if we got into a tough place, we'd take care of each other. But if you're always on your own, how do you reach out? And she didn't speak the language. She often didn't even know what city she was in. When she was rescued, it was wasn't like the movie Taken. There was no Liam Neeson, right? Rushing in to rescue her. She was placed with several other girls at a bar by the brothel owners who were unloading defective product because she was riddled with disease. And so when she came to the Doctors of the World shelter, she was very broken, very sick. You can imagine her flat affect from so much trauma. And they asked her how she had survived, because they had girls that jumped off of hotel roofs. But she said, I couldn't do that because they told me they would go get my 8-year-old brother. They knew where he was, and there's a market for boys. So to protect her brother, she stayed and did what they told her to do. So let's look at Maria's story. She was recruited and transported, but that's not necessary. You can have recruited on the same block and never go across the street, let alone cross a border. And they used fraud to lure her. They offered her a job that did not exist. They used force. They brutalized her to break her down. And then to keep her a prisoner, they used coercion. And they didn't just threaten to hurt her. They threatened to hurt her family member. And the purpose then was for commercial sex. So the federal model for attacking human trafficking uses 3 Ps, and in 2010 they added the 4th P: prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. And each one of these has a particular body of responsibility. And prosecution, if you were looking at a AAA guide now we do Yelp. That I was showing my age, right? Okay, now we do Yelp, and if it has $4 signs, then we're not going there tonight if I'm paying. But that's where the funding has spread out on here, mostly for prosecution. So there's like $4 signs here, 2 for protection. So we have shelters, but not enough. And then prevention, we're starting to see a little more funding for that, but very, very small amount. I guess I'd put $0.50 sign there. So that's why partnership is so important. What I love about being at Vanguard and the Global Center for Women and Justice is we're able to use our academic platform to provide those kind of resources, especially in our schools and our teachers, and what we're trying to do with healthcare providers to increase the ability to identify and intervene on behalf of victims. When we try to figure out what our role is, we have to understand what is the need and then look at our expertise and our resources. And that's how in the Trafficking in Persons report, that's how they defined partnership. Understanding the need and then using your resources and your expertise. So when I talk to healthcare providers, anybody here work in an ER or a walk-in clinic, those kinds of things, it's like, don't quit your job to go and rescue victims. Learn how to integrate what you're doing right where you are. That's how we can begin to end this. So what are we looking for? with regards to health problems that you might see. And these are in some ways kind of laundry lists that have been identified over the years through our Office for Victim Services. And I want to make sure that you have these, identifying victims of human trafficking. They sometimes are, let me grab this from you for just a second. This particular little card is now one of the easiest things to carry around if you're on duty. You can put it in a pocket, and it has some of the questions and some of the information that you would need to know. But a potential victim is going to present with a sense of not being in control. They may be looking at the person that's with them and looking to see if they can say something. They've often been programmed exactly what to say. So if you got caught with a kilo of heroin, you go to jail. But if you get caught with 2 girls that you're selling on Beach Boulevard and you've threatened them and told them this is what to say if we get stopped by the police, they're going to say what you told them to say, and the police don't have any evidence contrary to that. So being able to see if the person is always giving the information. One of the policies in many of our hospitals is you have to have a hospital translator. We learned this back in our school days when we studied DV, that if a family member who is the abuser is translating, and that you may not get very accurate information. So it's important to have protocols where someone else is going to be providing that translation. And looking for signs of physical abuse. A lot of times, particularly in sex trafficking, the physical abuse is hidden so that the product still looks good. A lot of how many of you have seen posters or movies about human trafficking? Yeah, so most of them are built on a lot of myths. They don't walk around with a lot of bruises, and there's this idea that somehow it's going to be really obvious. The movie Taken, a lot of people feel like this is what trafficking looks like, but those are Hollywood images, and there are awful things that happen, but when you see them on the street or when they walk in, you may not see that kind of obvious drama. In the Taken movie, 6 minutes into the movie, it would have been over if it was real human trafficking. Once, you guys all remember the storyline, the guy meets him at the airport, can I share your taxi? They go to their place. He invites them to a party. As soon as they said yes, they were done, because all they had to do is go to the party, put something in the drink, and we never know where they are. But instead, because it's Hollywood and you won't pay for a movie ticket to watch a 6-minute movie, they actually have the goons, they have lots of broken things and lots of evidence, and then the fast phone call to Liam Neeson, who's everybody wants a dad like that. So we're looking for things that are much more subtle. Somebody that's very submissive and fearful and has difficulty communicating. They may not have their own identification. And all of these things separately can be indicators of a lot of other things. But when you get enough pieces together to start asking questions, then you put that in the framework of those 3 columns, and you can identify a trafficking victim. They may not be able to come and leave as they want to. One of my own personal failures in anti-trafficking, I was home visiting my daughter in 2003, the year before I came back to the States, and she wanted to take me to get my nails done for Mother's Day, an early present. I said, that sounds wonderful. I didn't know the culture in Orange County for getting your nails done. There's like all of the girls doing the nails are speaking Vietnamese, and all of the women well, I live in Santa Ana, so you're usually speaking Spanish, but we were in Costa Mesa that day, and so they were speaking English. And the girl who was doing my nails, her name badge said her name was Helen, and she could barely speak English. So I said, "What's your real name?" And she said, "Americans can't say my name. It's too hard." I said, "Try me. I've lived in all these other countries. I speak 4 languages. I want to learn how to say your name." So she taught me her name, and then we started having a conversation. Now, I knew how to do this in Greece. It didn't even occur to me that it happened here. And so I started having a conversation, and just naturally, "So how long have you been in the States? How did you come here? Don't you just love living in Orange County?" Well, now we're like becoming friends. I know how to say her name. And she says to me, "I hate it here." So of course I was like, "Well, yeah, probably this isn't the best job. Have you thought about, going to school, getting another job?" And then a little tear slipped down her cheek, and she said, "I can't. It was an arranged marriage, and I work in a warehouse at night and here in the daytime." And then I realized that I had just put her at risk, because I just didn't think that anything would be going on in Costa Mesa, in Newport Beach. And I saw that the owner of the shop saw us having an intense conversation. So I tried to lighten things up, and we left, and I didn't even have a cell phone. I was just here for a few days, and I told my daughter, "So who do we call?" We called a local police department. They didn't know what I was talking about. This is 2003. We went online. We looked for something. The hotline didn't exist. I couldn't find any resources. I knew exactly what to do in Athens. So we went back, and they told us, "No, there's no Helen. There's never been a Helen working here." And my daughter went back the next week. There was no Helen. She sent her friends in. They moved her someplace else. So you can ask these questions without sounding like you're checking off a checklist, just by engaging in a normal conversation. But if the trafficker is there, if he's standing, or she, right next to the victim, you need to get them separate. She needs to be in a safe place. He needs to be in a safe place. There's a sense that in sex trafficking, about 16% are boys and young men now. And we're not looking for them. So we miss that. They may be in debt bondage. One father coming up across the border took a job so that he was offered so that he could make money to pay for his 6-year-old son's medication. And they told him, "We know you don't have the money. It costs anywhere from $3,000 to $5,000 to get smuggled across the border. So you can pay us later. When you get the money, then you can send part to your family and you can pay us off." Debt bondage. At the end of the first week, when they came, and of course they pay them in cash because they don't have bank accounts and they don't have ID. So the cash is there, and it's like, yay, it's going to be worth it. And then they pull out the ledger, and they start charging for your shaving cream and your cigarettes and the sheets that you're sleeping on that actually you're sharing with 3 other people, and charging for the top ramen. And so by the time you pay your living expenses, the interest on your loan, you've got $20 left. And the second week that happens, you begin to realize, "I'm trapped." And they don't say to themselves, "Oh, I'm a trafficking victim. I need to raise my hand and get help." No, they don't self-identify. There's a great deal of shame and the sense that I made a really stupid decision. How do I get out of it? And not seeing a way out of it. Debt bondage. In some situations, especially sweat houses, sweatshops, they'll actually have security to keep people in instead of keeping people out. There are some great pictures you can find online of the El Monte case where somebody was driving by this one location all the time and it finally bothered him enough. He couldn't figure out why the wrought iron was facing in the spikes instead of out. So instead of trying to keep people from coming in, it actually was to keep people from getting out. And they rescued several dozen Thai workers who were slaves in that textile sweatshop. So being aware of those kinds of things. Many times the people, and see, this is the thing where it's not easy. You have to do a little bit of digging. They may seem depressed and nervous and paranoid. That's for a lot of things. But if you put that together with some of these other aspects, that's when you begin to build a case that this may be trafficking. And if you call the hotline, you don't have to have all the evidence, oh, this is a trafficking case. You just need to let them know something doesn't look right. And they'll collect the data and they'll ask you the questions that they need to have answers. They are often very anxious if there's law enforcement around, and the idea of denying anything because of shame and disbelief. And they're often confused because of culture and language. And one of the things that happens is we think the traffickers are going to be men and the victims are going to be women. And that's not true. About 40% of traffickers in the last few years where they've been tracking that have been women. Labor trafficking traffickers and sex trafficking traffickers. So, see, women's equality, women's empowerment, that's what I talk about all the time, right? So they often don't have very many personal possessions and they're not in control of their own money. One victim always said, well, the people I work for, my employer, they're keeping my money and they're gonna give it to me when I'm ready. Well, there was no money anywhere. They don't have their own ID or passport. In one particular raid in Garden Grove, all the passports were on the trafficker's nightstand under his gun. So it's dangerous. The criminals have weapons, and there are some people who want to go out and do their own investigations, and that's pretty dangerous. So we try to encourage people just to call the what number? Great. And Julie, I got so excited and I was paying attention to all these other things that when we're talking about labor trafficking, our Live to Free students, and you've got a little Live to Free card, they actually started going out to the schools when we first started the club, when pretty soon after I came back to the States. And the principal wouldn't let us talk about sex trafficking because he said it was too mature of a theme. Well, I saw a report that 264,000 children were slaves on cocoa plantations so you can have cheap chocolate. First of all, I wouldn't eat chocolate unless, and I still don't, unless it's fair trade. And so we started taking fair trade chocolate into the schools to teach about human trafficking. And so your professor has provided a taste of justice for you. So this happens to be my favorite. It's dark chocolate from Trader Joe's. You can pass that one back on this side. And Julie, you can pass this one back. Because this chocolate bar costs $2. And some people will say, well, that's too much to spend. But it's fair trade. No children are slaves. Kids are getting an education. Parents are getting paid a living wage so they can educate their kids. So I actually think it's a better return on investment. And it's really good stewardship. So that's enough preaching. Okay. Communicating strict confidentiality. And one of the things that I always want to make sure we remember is that a public setting, if you start asking those questions, don't do like I did with the nail salon. Make sure you can move someplace where you have privacy, where the trafficker can't see. In this day and age where we often do exams with just a little curtain around, that's not going to cut it. And if there's a window in the door, you need to make sure that he doesn't or she doesn't move over and stand at an angle where they can see, because the victim is going to be really anxious and looking there and not going to give you the kind of information that you need. And many times, even when you recover, we often say recover instead of rescue, the victims end up getting back into the same circumstance. So not too many people around them, and be as indirect and culturally sensitive. And the phrase trafficking may not have any meaning for them at all. And a lot of people ask me, why did they choose trafficking? Because trafficking is an international legal term for anything that you're not supposed to sell. What else? You see trafficking of drugs and guns and weapons. So trafficking of people, it's contraband. You cannot sell people. This is where healthcare providers have such an edge, because you start with a trust deposit, and you need to be aware of that privilege and use that to your advantage. Some of the things that you can say, and this is exactly what is on the Health and Human Services, and so I want to actually comment on a couple things. You can say we are here to help you, and our priority is your safety. You can say if you're a victim and you cooperate, you will not be deported. But you need to be really careful with that, because we've had problems when victims have been told that, and then the prosecutors, not the defenders, the public defenders of the traffickers, say they're lying in order to not be deported. So it's better not to bring up those kind of things. So I would eliminate that, but it is on the HHS website, so I leave it up there. We will give you medical care, we'll find you a safe place, we'll get you the help that you need. And you are entitled to assistance. So sometimes I talk to healthcare providers, and there are intersections of violent crimes, and so they already have like this maybe a sexual assault situation, that sort of thing. And so they said, well, we've already got this covered. But my point is, if we can identify this person as a trafficking victim as well, we get more resources for them. And the Victim Compensation Board here in California has some resources. The governor finally signed money into victim services specifically for human trafficking about 3 weeks ago. And so how do we get the best assistance that we possibly can? And so taking advantage of all of those resources. See, I was going to take out a slide where I thought it was double, and I kind of think this is the one I was going to take out. But basically, can you leave your work or job, like I asked that young woman, and is your family been threatened? They did an investigation down south of southeastern part of San Diego, and they found a house, 1940s, 1 bath. So think 1940s, how big were the bedrooms? You couldn't put a king-size bed in them. And 42 men were sleeping and living in that house. They literally had taken the sheetrock off the walls so that they could sleep in between the studs in the walls. So when you look then at the health problems, you can see where there's sanitation is a problem, hygiene. If somebody got the bathtub, they went in there to sleep, not to take a bath, because they could have more room. Inadequate nutrition. I went on one raid with Westminster PD, and when we got to the kitchen area, the refrigerator was full of KY jelly and condoms, and there were boxes and boxes and boxes of ramen noodles. That was it, ramen noodles. So inadequate nutrition and hygiene, generally a lack of medical care. Lots of, in sex trafficking, lots of STDs. Interestingly, there's kind of this idea that, well, if they're labor trafficked, it's better. It's not as bad. But in labor trafficking situations, over and over again, we see stories of sexual assault. And if you look back at our own transatlantic slave trade days and that history, you know that women were sexually assaulted. They were raped, and this was a common practice, and it happens now in labor trafficking as well. Malnourishment, dental problems. Probably whenever I talk to my friends in victim services at the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force, do you have dentists who will provide pro bono services? Because the funds for medical and dental are not ever as much as we really need, but they have a lot of dental problems. Infectious diseases like tuberculosis. Why should we as healthcare providers be concerned about that? Say what? They transmit one another. Yes, yes. And you have to take precautions for yourself too. You need to make sure you're in well-ventilated areas because you don't want to have the same problem. And again, like I mentioned earlier, they're often beaten in areas that will not damage their outward appearance. A lot of what we learned in DV transfers to what you need to know about human trafficking. The healthcare issues that are just normal in our general population impact these victims, but they didn't get any services. And so I still remember very vividly when one of our survivors was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it was very late stage. It could have been curable. So when she died, it really impacted our whole community. So we try to make sure that they get more than just emergency health care, but they get all the health care that they need to have. Trauma-informed. Trauma-informed. How many of you have had trauma-informed training somehow? Okay. So when you're looking at a trauma-informed model, the SAMHSA model is one of the best, and it always starts with safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, which is why I think healthcare providers are so high up on the list. So they need to feel safe, and they need to know that they can trust you. In a trauma-informed, we don't want to isolate people. We want them to be in their peer group. We want them to feel comfortable and that they have some control. So this idea of collaboration and mutuality really feeds the shared decision-making concept of having your own voice and empowerment and choice. Now, when you're taking care of someone who is in a really desperate situation, you can't ask them, so what do you want to do? Number one, they don't know what their options are. And number two, they probably would say, I want to leave. I don't want to do this. So it's pretty much like raising kids. When they're 2 and when they're 16, they kind of go through the same, everything is no, right? Anybody have a 2-year-old? Anybody have a 16-year-old? Okay, yeah, so you have to give them choices. I remember when my firstborn, she was so compliant. My secondborn, she started saying no at a really young age. She was like 14 months, not 2 years old. So to get her shoes on her, I had to learn to say, do you want to put your left shoe on first or your right shoe on? Because if she wasn't in charge, nothing happening. And this is very much the same kind of principle. You have to give them choices. So you can't say, do you want to eat? Because they're going to say no. But you can say, do you want us to order a hamburger, or would you like us to get you a salad? You know, what is it? So you give them some choice. And that's a huge part of this. Shared decision making. Yeah, I know you have to talk to the investigator, but you don't have to talk to him this morning. We could do it this afternoon. Do you see where I'm going with this? They have some choice. They have some opportunity to be part of making the decision. And then in a trauma-informed approach, understanding gender, culture, and historical concepts is super important. I lived in Greece, and we were working with Arabic speaking Middle Easterners, and so here I am, a woman. Well, I can't go up and stand over a man. That's just totally not going to be okay. So if I'm going to talk to a man, I need to sit down if he's sitting. And a man who's going to go and speak to a woman needs to make sure he observes certain protocols as well. So those are just some principles, and I just put them out there because if you don't have this experience, you can go to this website, and there's tons of materials on trauma-informed care. I'm looking at the time, and so these are kind of different ways of saying what we've already said. I do want to point out that if you are the charge nurse and you're not going to have time, you need to give up your ego, because it's kind of fun to be in charge of this part, and assign this potential victim to somebody who's going to be able to stay with them and develop that rapport. Does that make sense? This is probably one of the biggest mistakes that we make in healthcare. We run in and we want to be the hero, and we don't realize then when we leave that they feel abandoned and they're not going to bond the same way. So start them with someone who's going to be able to stay with them. Just basically some guidelines using multidisciplinary resources and making sure that you have institutional protocols, and we'll talk about that. This is a model, and it doesn't fit on one slide, but having some of the red flags. So you create a protocol for when people come into your clinic, into your emergency room, into your primary care, and then you, just like any protocol, if you see these things and it's yes, you go to this box. If it's no, okay, you're done. But if it's yes, then you have to assess for potential danger. And this is probably the hardest part for most people engaged in trying to make these assessments. They feel frustrated when they can't just rescue. So we're going to talk a little bit about anticipatory guidance and what you say to someone when you think that they need assistance, but you can't do something right now. And then calling the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline and getting local resources. So in Orange County, you're really blessed because we have the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force. But if you go up to Merced County, they don't have a task force. They have a tiny little coalition with 1 or 2 NGOs and a handful of law enforcement people who are trying to kind of put something together. So that's why it's really important to call that 800 number, because they'll know who's closest that can provide the deeper resources that you're going to need. And again, if it is an emergency, if it's happening right in front of you, don't wait to call the hotline, call 911. Call 911 right now. And in Orange County, our 911 operators are all trained in human trafficking and are able to deploy the right kind of resources. So you're in a good place. HIPAA concerns. This is usually a question, so I like to talk about it before you ask me questions. It's not a barrier to identifying and reporting victims. and actually mandatory reporting for child sex trafficking and other vulnerable victims is the law. And you can, whenever you're really concerned that you might be overstepping, you can do an anonymous report. And that's not as helpful for follow-up, but you can do that. Hospitals, medical clinics, we all need to have very clear reporting policies because that protects our staff. Referrals. So what if you can't report, we can't go and rescue? You can still provide referrals to organizations that can assist. The Public Law Center here in Orange County, food and clothing and emergency treatment resources, those kinds of things. So knowing what is available in your community is really important to be prepared to deal with the victims that you don't get to help right this minute. Oh, yes, just in case anybody still has, so this is a slide directly from the HIPAA module at, for the training on HIPAA. Okay, so now commercial sexual exploitation of children, which is probably what you see more of in videos, news reports, and that sort of thing. And that 14-year-old boy that I talked about, he was a commercially sexually exploited child. We never use the term child prostitute. I don't even really like child sex trafficking because it doesn't really define the problem. The real problem is that someone is making money selling a child. And I'll never forget hearing a lieutenant from Stockholm, Sweden, presenting at a conference in Athens where he had a picture of a Stockholm newspaper and it showed a headline of 12-year-old girl selling sex in the streets. And he said, this is the wrong headline. What we really need to have in big letters is Stockholm men purchasing a child for sex. And that's happening right here in Orange County. My friend, Sergeant Juan Ravelis at the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force is out of Anaheim PD. And 2 blocks from Disneyland, he said, on any given night, you can find underage girls that traffickers are bringing into our area. Why are they coming? Because there is demand, because there are people willing to purchase them. So this is not just a legal issue about human rights, but it is about greed, people wanting to make money. So remember the 3 columns from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act? What were they? This is the quiz to see if you're still awake.
Prevention, purpose, protection, partnership.
Okay, that is the model for how we fight it, but the AMP model, action, means, and purpose, had 3 columns. But the middle one, if it's a minor, we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. If that child is obtained and sold for a commercial sex act, not just to a date, but whether it's online pornography. There was a Northern European guy that was prosecuted and sent to prison for a really long time because he paid to have a child in the Philippines raped on camera. Commercial sex is a lot more than, there's a lot more things. The pornography, strip clubs, gentlemen clubs, escorts, all of those kinds of things. But we don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion like we did for Maria. Okay, so this is a continuum that was developed out of a research project that DOJ funded for 5 years and had regions from Florida, San Diego, Seattle, San Francisco, and Chicago. Is that 5? And New York. New York, that makes it 5. And I love this, not because of, yes, these are horrible things, but because this is where you can actually start to make a plan for early intervention. So if a child is being sexually abused, then they begin to develop patterns of thinking that link love and sex. And they have, as they start to get a little older, they begin to experience shame. They see themselves objectified. And when they get to an age where they suddenly feel empowered, they're maybe 14 years old, and they think, I can do something about it, they might run away. And we see that over and over and over again. And now they're out on the street, and adults take advantage of the power differential and recruit and abuse them, exploit them, and then because of demand, that drives business. So that commercial sexual exploitation of children occurs. And so there is a difference between child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, and commercial sexual exploitation. Here, someone is making a profit. We had a case here in Newport Beach several years ago where a local photographer was trading headshots for sex with young girls. That was sexual exploitation of a child. When 4-year-old Johnny is being abused by his uncle, that's child sexual abuse. So we have to understand those terms. You all know your brain is not this color, right? Just checking, okay. But I want to kind of talk a little bit about how we do prevention with our youth. We look at, I go out, I'm going to be at a middle school on Thursday, 6 periods back to back, 35 kids. I'm going to be a basket case when I'm done. They're going to be bigger than I am. So you look at somebody and you think, well, this is an adult, but you have to think about their brain. So the prefrontal cortex, which is where risk management is housed, executive decision making, that is just barely starting to develop. So the blue is your prefrontal cortex. Your limbic system is where all those emotional responses to rewards and anger and movies and music, it's just going in and out. And when you're talking trauma-informed, then someone who has experienced a lot of abuse, they think from the fight or flight response, from their lizard brain about survival. But how many of you have talked to your teenager? She's just got home from school, and she's never going to talk to her best friend, Sally, because they're not best friends anymore. And so you ask what's going on, and when she tells you, you're ready to call Sally's mom because something is just not right. And then you go and you take care, and you're calling your daughter now for dinner, and she's like, I'm on the phone. Who are you on the phone with? Sally. Because she's right here thinking through all these things. And it's just ups and downs, and you can't always keep up with that. And the kids, their executive decision making, their risk management skills are not well developed. And this is something that you have to understand if you're going to work with kids or if you're going to encounter kids in your work. Because telling them about trafficking, don't go meet the guy online, don't hang out with kids at the mall. They don't pay attention to you because they are invincible. They're teenagers. And what do they say? Sally's mom lets her do that. Or you don't trust me, or I can take care of myself. So when kids are recruited online, we think that they should be a little smarter. I've got this set of pictures from our AUSA, our U.S. attorney here in Orange County, that she gave me because I so often talk to parents. And how many of you are parents? Yes. And we think our kids are smarter, and they are smart. They're not finished developing. And so we tell them not to make friends with strangers. We tell them not to talk to somebody in a chat room. And we think they're going to be able to manage this. But when I show you the pictures of this guy who recruited 3 girls, he's serving 17 years right now in a federal prison, recruited 3 girls from as far away as Florida to come to California, where he then sold them online for sex. This is how he recruited them. So, yeah, I see grins. It's like, who's going to fall for this? This looks like Hollywood, right? This is from his social media. This is how I'm a talent agent. You can trust me, come. He's got the bling and the hustle shirt, and he's got money to burn. 3 girls, 15 and 17, came to Orange County. See, their brains aren't done yet. Girls' brains aren't done until they're 18 to 21, and guys, so sorry, 24 to 26. You knew that was coming, didn't you? Yes. So they're just really vulnerable, and we cannot depend on them to protect themselves. This is my point. The factors that increase risk are really, this is that continuum, but now it's in a linear format for those of you who like lists instead of diagrams. The recruitment methods are often through Romeo pimps who tell them that they love them. Sometimes it's peer recruitment in a common theme that we started seeing over a year ago. Young girls would go into the school, and they were tasked with recruiting, and they would get prizes because now they had grown into the business. And so they would find the girl who nobody else was sitting with at lunch and make friends, go and sit with them. And then they'd say, do you like my nails? Well, yeah. Do you want to go get your nails done? Yeah, but I can't. I don't have any money. Oh, that's okay. My boyfriend's going to pay for you. And so then she takes her to get her nails done, and her boyfriend pays, and eventually they start grooming her and eventually traffic her, and she becomes part of that stable. Modeling and acting, 12-year-old girl in Chicago, true story case from LA City DA's office. 12-year-old, wants to be a model, lives in suburbia, Chicago. Mom and dad said, when you finish college, if you still want to be a model, fine, but you've got to get good grades in high school, go to college, then you can be a model. But she wants to be a model, and she's a little bit spoiled, and she has her own laptop. So at night, she's online, and she goes into modeling chat rooms and meets somebody who tells her she's beautiful. And she would make a great model. She would even become a star. And so he wants to help her with her career. And eventually he sends her a cell phone so her parents won't know that he's talking to her. They text back and forth, and he says, when there's just the right casting call, I'm going to bring you out here, and you'll be gone for and then we'll send you back. And your parents will learn that you do have talent. So one night, a taxi goes to her house, and she sneaks out and gets in the taxi. She's 12 years old. Did you know that you only have to have an adult or a paper with you if you're under 12 to fly? She goes through Chicago O'Hare Airport. She goes through TSA, and she gets on a plane to Los Angeles. And she's almost to LA when she starts getting a little agitated and the attendant stops to see how she's doing, because she's been a little concerned that this child is traveling alone. And the child says, I've never been away from home overnight in my whole life. And then pours out the whole story. Well, of course, when the plane landed, the people were really upset because they couldn't get off, because the police had to come on and get this little girl off the plane. They took her phone. They met the guy who was picking her up. They did forensics on that phone, and they found out where the ISP was for blah, blah. I don't understand all that. Somebody here, Mikey understands that. Yes. And they rolled out to a house in San Diego where they rescued 17 children. Modeling, dancing, acting. Seduction and coercion. I met a girl when I first came back to California from Greece. She was 18 at the time, and she told me her story. When she was 14, her mom, professional, they lived in a nice track home, fell in love. And mom's boyfriend moved in, and you've already guessed it, molested 14-year-old, we'll call her Anna. And child welfare is called. They go out, they take Anna out, and as often happens, Anna goes to a group home. And you know, group homes are safe, but they are not secure. So nobody can get in, but they can walk. And there's nothing we can do to stop that. So after a couple of days, she doesn't like the group home, and so she runs away. And now it's 1 o'clock on a park bench because she didn't like where she was, and she's 14, and she can do something about it, but she doesn't have a plan. And so 1 o'clock in the morning, she's on a park bench, and this guy, and when she told me this story, I went home, I told my husband, he's got a psych degree. He's got to had taken psychology in college. He goes to the park, to the bus station, or to the mall, and to find new product. And when he gets to before he gets to the park, he stops and buys a $1 menu hamburger. And then as he goes into the park, he sees her, and he goes into his routine. And he stops and he looks concerned and says, "Are you okay? What are you doing out here?" And she knows to be afraid of, oh, you're a good class. I'm glad you got your chocolate. She knows to be afraid of strangers. You know, a little bit of that prefrontal cortex is developed. And she knows to brush her teeth, those kinds of things. But he starts to walk away. And then he stops and he says, "You know, I just bought this hamburger and you look like you're hungry. Do you want it?" I'm not really that hungry, and it's still warm. And she's like, "Yeah, I'm hungry." Remember, she didn't think through how she was going to survive running away. So he comes back, he sits down on the bench with her, and now she eats the food he gave her. He's positioning himself to be the caretaker. And he asks questions, the same kind of questions that if you want to have a good marriage, you ask and listen to the other person. He showed concern. And now, when she's done, he takes the trash, because remember, he's taking care of her. And he walks all the way over to the trash can. And as he's turning to start to leave, he stops and he looks back at her and he says, "I don't know if it's safe for you out here." Well, yeah, she's scared to death. So he says, maybe you should come home and sleep on my couch tonight, and then tomorrow we'll figure out what to do. Is he still a stranger? Adults, yes, but for a 14-year-old, no. He's fed her, he cares about her safety, and now he's offered her a place to stay. So he takes her home, and the next day he takes her shopping, And he buys her a phone, and by the end of the week, he's telling her how beautiful she is, and he's falling in love with her, and she's how old? And he is 26. By the end of the second week, he's telling her, we need to make some money, and I know you love me, and I love you, and so here's what you need to do. And the third night, when she comes home and early, he says, no, I'm locking you out. You have to bring $1,000 in tonight. And then she found out there were 2 other girls in his stable. And the first time that she got picked up, she went straight back when she got out of juvenile hall to her pimp and the other 2 girls. He told her, I love you, and when you turn 18, we're going to get married. So all this money we're making with 3 girls, that's to buy our house. So she felt loved and beautiful, and she was a business partner. I told you, I thought he was a psychologist, because look at, think through. What did he do first? He fed her. He gave her a safe place. He started telling her how beautiful she was and that he loved her. And then self-actualization. And R.J. Martin wrote an article, How to Be a Pimp Using Maslow's Hierarchy of Human Need to Make the Most Money. And in it, it says, make her think she's your partner. Fortunately, when Anna was 15, about 8 months into this, she was picked up in Nevada, where they had a special court for C-sec victims. He went to prison for 25 years, and she went home, got her GED, and went to college. But can you see how important it is to understand brain development and how the traffickers manipulate the victims? When we see these victims, and here's the thing, when they turn 18, they don't suddenly get mature, especially when they've experienced trauma repeatedly. So the development of their brain has been obstructed. And so just like you see in DV, you'll see hypervigilant activity. So that means they're looking at their exploiter and they don't want you to make them mad, because they know what will happen. And they try to keep them happy, and they actually get inside their heads. And they see things from the exploiter's perspective, and they try to keep the outside authorities from upsetting him. And they don't see the outside authorities as their rescuers. They actually might see them as at risk, and they'll see the pimp as their protector. Because see, what's happened, and it's happened enough times in the system, they've been picked up, and then nothing good happens, so they go back to their exploiter, because he's the only one who really takes care of them, and they begin to believe that. So when you look at the trauma bonding process, you have the basic that you learned about in domestic violence, the imbalance of power. But the abusive behavior is sporadic. So every once in a while, he buys her a present, he takes her out for a meal, he brings flowers. And somehow, those highly intense positives are balanced with the negatives, and it's alternating so that it actually creates this trauma bond. And so then the victim actually denies the abuse just to maintain their own mental status quo. I don't know why that's shaking, because it's like, are we having an earthquake? Yeah, okay. Denial of the abuse for their own emotional self-protection. And if you have been a victim of chronic trauma, so you think about that pink line, and you've run away from trauma already, and now you get into a trauma relationship, then you have chronic trauma, and it impacts how you think. As soon as your dad came home and started beating your mother, when you got used to the fact that when you heard his footsteps, the best thing to do would be run, right? Fight or flight. So you skip all the thinking and you go straight to your survival brain. And that makes it really hard to think. And you have to learn new pathways. So people do things that seem completely irrational. And they'll go back to that guy over and over again. And you think, I did everything I could. I told them. And so we make this mistake of thinking we can be logical with them. When people have chronic trauma, they often dissociate, and that's because you just can't function in that kind of pain. And so literally your brain finds a way to escape. And victims will say to me, it was like I was watching somebody else. This was happening to somebody else. And the cognitive dissonance, that idea that it doesn't make sense, is something that they have to cope with. So they actually change how they perceive reality. They will explain to you why he was raised in such a situation, and you can't really blame him. And so they'll take the blame themselves. You've heard this in domestic violence stories, and you'll hear the same thing in CSEC cases. They will, probably the most significant thing that you'll see in their relationship is hypervigilant, and they're in relationships with older adults. And you want to help them, and you are thinking like you're the helper and they're the victim, but they see you as the enemy. And it's really important for you to understand that they don't trust you, because remember, I said don't forget this, confirmation bias. What happened with Shima? He told her they're going to put you in a police car and you're never going to see your family. She believed that. It took 2 years before she was willing to tell her story. 2 years, because she believed that. Anticipatory guidance. This is what, when you can't do anything, you can think through how you can, just like when you send a patient home after surgery, you say if there's a red line near the wound, you need to come back. If you get diarrhea from the meds, you need to come back, one of those things. So we're going to think, what can you say to a potential victim? And they're not going to self-identify, so you want to decentralize the conversation and use a neutral, peer-led approach. So the best questions are, if you know someone with this circumstance, you can give them this card, and it has the text number where you can get help. Or if they don't want to have a card, you can break apart this tiny little key fob and give it to them. Because, see, they don't want to have anything that someone's going to see that they have, and they'll get in trouble. So you want to be really careful, but you give them the referral number. So then they have it for their community. Our Live to Free students do this all the time with these little green cards. And actually, some of our partners have said that this little green card is easier to give away than this because this looks too government. So that's just a tip from what some of the students have said to us. I want to just introduce the idea of looking at human trafficking as a public health issue. And the reason that I want to do that is because from a public health perspective, we think we can do something about it, and we invest. Think of Zika virus, how much money went to find a solution. We need to do that, and it informs our policies, and it addresses issues with urgency. So what does a public health model look like? Well, you have to ask, how did this victim get here? How did this victim get here? So what's the why? So let's look at the first principle of public health is predict what the problem is. Can anybody tell me what's going to happen if this little girl grows up eating lollipops? Cavities, right. So then we have to develop a way to protect her from cavities. What could we do? Think about it. Say what? Okay, so we do every single year toothbrushes. We pass them out, every kid, and you get that little blue thing, and then they put the black light, and they help kids practice not getting cavities. Do they make the kids quit eating candy? Is that a really viable solution to cavities? Get rid of all the candy. See, this is what I think. I don't think that we can end human trafficking with red flags to 14-year-olds. So I think we have to have a better way of protecting them. And then they have to practice. We've passed a couple of laws in the last few years here in California where they are going to get training in school for a week in 7th grade and in 9th grade. So I have this idea that I want to take a bunch of kids' toothbrushes to Sacramento and pass them out to our legislators and tell them, you get to use this toothbrush this week, and in 2 years you can use it again. Because from a public health model, that's the kind of laws that we're passing. So we, as healthcare providers, as experts in the field, we have a voice in policy development, and we have to start using our public health models. Anybody here work in a public health setting? Tell your friends. Okay. Public health determines who intervenes, how they intervene, and where the front line is. For, okay, yeah. So public health is going to target anti-trafficking efforts to reduce the risk of the highest risk populations. And right now, the easy population for us to address are minors. And we're learning how to do a better job in labor trafficking. This is like one of my favorite diagrams from a pediatric journal. And how many of you are in pediatrics? Yay, so we can have a conversation about this, okay? It's way too much for now, it's getting late. We have here at Vanguard the Ending Human Trafficking podcast, and it's recognized across the states as a way to get up to speed. Everything that I've talked about today, you can look it up, and there's a podcast, there's like 180 of them, and they're like 30 minutes, so you can listen to them on your way to work, whatever. And we just launched in January this year a Spanish language podcast, so those are resources for you. We want to educate vulnerable people, and the Blue Campaign has a website, and you all have the Blue Campaign little cards where you can order free posters to put up in transit stations, in rural communities, hold trainings for healthcare workers. I want to do a Train the Train because, like Julie said, I can't do this every single day, and there is a growing sense that we are waking up to that statistic I started with. 87.8% of victims, survivor victims, saw a healthcare provider who didn't see that they were trafficking victims. Prevention. We can prevent, and we can do early intervention. And these are just resources if you want to do a training, and Dr. Wilson has links to all of these. I think she's going to show you a video. You're going to show the Shima video? Oh, it's fabulous. And hear from Shima herself. We have an online human trafficking certificate with 4 3-unit classes, and we're adding a 5th class in January. And there's my contact information. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help you. And if you want more information, then please check out the podcast. So, thank you.